Hey, thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Business Fun Podcast. I am your host, Dave Wakeman. My guest today is author Ncaa Lever. Ncaa is her pen name. And we talk about her book, Surviving the Second Tier, which is a dystopian novel about being a college athlete. I make several jokes that it is not a horror story and not a dystopian novel because it hits too close to home. And that was the point of the book. And we had a really great conversation about all kinds of stuff. This one was really a lot of fun. I actually just finished recording it about an hour ago. I wanted to get it out so quickly because I enjoyed it. And I thought also her book came out yesterday. So I wanted to give her a little promotional push, as the saying goes. How's everybody doing? Always, even as we're continuing to open up and continuing to have fun and excitement come down, if you need somebody to talk to, let me know. It's davidwakeman.com. I appear to be hitting the road in March, heading off to some of my favorite locales like London and Paris, and maybe even Birmingham, England. I don't know. We'll see about this. But I'm looking to get over to Europe for a week at mid-March. Still finalizing all the details of my travel, but I will let you know. Make sure that you check out my friends. Did you see Simon, Mab, and Dave Wakeman in Sportico about a week or so ago talking about refund protection, about what it means for people, all kinds of stuff. If you haven't already, I'll send you a link. Well, you know I will. All right, so check that out. Let's get that link going. It's really good. But check out Book and Protect. As I've talked about before here and talk about in the article for Sportico, the refund protection product have been being taken up at a level that's probably twice what it was before the pandemic. They will be in Birmingham. Simon's giving a talk on security after the terrorism attack in Manchester. Haley, Kath, the whole team I think will be there. It's going to be great. So check them out, bookingprotect.com. Make sure you get my newsletter. It is Talking Tickets, talkingtickets.substack.com. It's really like 4 stories and some links and blurbs now. Whatever it is, it gets open more than anything I do. It gets more engagement than anything I do. I wrote this thing about NFTs the other day that people went nuts over. Get it, talkingtickets.substack.com. And inside the Talking Tickets, or just in general, I am doing a survey because I'm trying to put together to see if it makes sense to do a podference. So a podcast-based conference about the road to recovery to help everybody recover from the pandemic. I'm trying to figure out if that is a valid idea or if I should try something else. So let me know. There is a survey. I'm going to put it in the show notes. I'll attach it to everything. It asks you how to make the podcast better, how to make the newsletter better, and whether or not and what you would like to learn from the podference. It helped me out. It'd take you about 2 minutes, and that would be super awesome. So back to Ncaa. Ncaa Lever is studying to get her doctorate at the University of Texas, Austin. She is a former Division I college athlete, and she wrote this book called Surviving the Second Tier because she felt like some of the statistics and some of the examples of the life of a college athlete were not making it through, that people were ignoring the realities. And so she thought that the best way to convey her point was through a novel. I tend to agree. There's some pretty incredible numbers that I share with people, and they just kind of feel like they fall on deaf ears. So sometimes having a story or to attach to the numbers or using a different mode of communication seems to be super helpful. I mean, that's one of the reasons I started the podcast, is because it seemed to be much more effective at conveying my thoughts and getting my point across through a conversation. So we talk about the novel, but that's really just a doorway into her academic research, the commodification of college athletics, exploitation of athletes. We talk about the name, image, and likeness rights issue. And there was this is my joke because it seems like only white dudes get to talk about it. I was the only white dude present in the conversation. We talk about how kids were treated during the pandemic. I mentioned how uncomfortable I felt with the 60 Minutes profile of Ed Ogeron, because I would have a hard time sending my kid to the college because that guy seemed like pretty much, I don't want to say he seemed like a numpty. And it's but how that's a complicated problem, and it's just a sign of like some of the deeper systemic issues we're dealing with. We talked about the weird balance in the NIL legislation. We talked about what's driving the passive nature of the response from the NCAA. We got into antitrust law. We didn't touch on monopoly power. Dang, I missed an opportunity there. We talked about innovation. We talked about what she hopes people take away from the book. We even made Brett Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court even made its way into the conversation in a completely amusing way. It was pretty good. And so, I mean, this was a really great conversation. I feel like we probably have way more stuff that we could uncover here, but I enjoyed this. I think that Nca's book is really an interesting way to try to tell people and teach people about the lives of college athletes. And I really support her and this book, and I'm really glad that we had a chance to talk. So here's my conversation with Ncaa Lever on The Business of Fun. Oh, here we go. So I'm happy to welcome Ncaa Lever, like the soap. That's what Ncaa told me to say, to the Business of Fun podcast. Ncaa, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm great. Now that we had some technical difficulties that were all on me, now we're here. I told you that the book that we're going to talk about, Surviving the Second Tier, could it be a horror story or a dystopian novel? And I go, no, I think it's too close to reality for both of them. So I'm very excited because I think we're going to we might laugh, but it'll be like laughter that keep us from crying. But thank you so much for coming on. I'm excited to hear about the book and talk to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Dave. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's start with the book. It's called Surviving the Second Tier. You get it at all your fancy bookstores and order it online, all these things. It's a cool story because you have a background in college athletics, and you played at Texas, at UT Austin. Is that right? Or
so I'm getting my PhD at UT Austin. I completed Kentucky University.
Okay, because I had it backwards. See, you can't trust me with anything. And so you write from experience. And so, can you tell us a little bit about the book?
So my book is a novel about the issues in the college sports industry, and it's set as a futuristic dystopia. And the reason that I wrote a fictional take on this is because, as someone who does academic research, I've learned over the years that sometimes these facts and statistics just don't stick with people for some reason. I think we've also learned that in the pandemic, unfortunately. And so I decided that it might be a better option to tell people a story and see how it landed with people and see if it resonated with people. And so far it has, and that makes me really happy, because I think a lot of the times when we see athletes, and not just college athletes, but professional and Olympic athletes as well, we tend to view them as statistics, or as, oh, how much is this athlete making per year, or what can this athlete do for my fantasy league? And we don't really tend to see their human side. And so I wanted to write about the current issues in the college sports industry from a very direct perspective, so that readers could get emotionally invested into the lives of college athletes.
I think that idea that stats don't stick with people, it seems to be very true. I'm known for using a lot of data, not necessarily in the conversations like this, but in my work. And I'm always struck that I have to weave a narrative around the number to get the number across, right? Even though the number alone is probably often like, holy buckets, I need to do this. And and I'm curious, because you said that, like, a lot of times when we think about athletes, college or professional, we tend to think of them as statistics or ways to help our fantasy team. I haven't played fantasy sports in a long, long time. And I think part of it is because of this thing, but it dehumanizes the entire operation. And I don't know if you have an opinion, but I'm guessing you do. And if you don't, you just tell me I'm an idiot and like tell me to move on with my day, and I'll be totally fine, because you wouldn't be the first one. But do you think that kind of the rise of all of this sort of it's almost financialization of sports and athletics has led to the dehumanization? And it encourages a lot of this bad behavior.
Yeah, I would say it definitely contributes to it. And I'm a person who doesn't think that there's anything inherently wrong with earning money from collegiate athletics. I don't think that that is a morally bad thing to do. But what I do think is wrong is to exploit the athletes, whether it's physical exploitation or financial exploitation, by keeping the revenue away from them, physical exploitation by pushing them well beyond their limits for the sake of winning and feeding into that commercialization and the prestige of programs. And so I don't think that there's anything morally wrong about the commercialization of college athletics, but what I do think is wrong is the ways that it negatively impacts athletes.
Right, but we don't have the money for anything. MK, we don't have how could we treat the athletes better? We don't have the money. I mean, there's not billions of dollars that come into sports every year. We can't possibly treat them well.
Yeah,
like how do you fight back about that?
Well, my first rebuttal to that argument is, how much is your football coach being paid? Could he take a salary cut? Because I look at the kinds of money, or the kind of money that's being spent on facilities, just for useless renovations or upgrades that aren't necessary, but that are used for recruiting young athletes who are minors, by the way. So that's a whole other ethical dilemma, is using those tactics to draw minors to a school. And then I look at administrative salaries and coach salaries, and then I always talk back and say, are there cuts that could be made in other areas to better benefit the athletes? And I believe, with a little creative thinking, that the answer is more often than not yes.
I would push back just ever so slightly on this thing where you say that without a little bit of effort, you could find cuts or reasonable accommodations that we made for kids. And I told you about my experience at the University of Alabama, being surrounded by going to class with kids and living in the dorms with walk-ons and stuff. I would say it wouldn't take much effort at all to find reasonable cuts or reasonable ways to improve the quality of life. And I realized that as soon as I say something like this, somebody's going to email me or text me or tweet at me or whatever and go, well, the kids at the University of Alabama are okay. They might be okay, but there's thousands of kids that are not playing football at the University of Alabama that really are getting treated poorly. And it's because, like you said, there's needless and unnecessary improvements. The coaching salaries are ridiculous, right? Because I think that to me, here's a good example to illustrate it, and it's probably explains, at least to my mind, how absurd the whole operation is that Nick Saban is probably, without a doubt, the best coach in college football, but yet at this point he's not the highest paid. And there's this competition, to looking at LSU to see who can lose to Nick Saban the most and get paid more. Yeah, and the waterfalls in the locker rooms and stuff. I mean, it really is absurd. And so this goes to a question, which is I don't necessarily know if really I agree with you. There's nothing wrong with making money off of the thing, but I don't know that the NIL is going to necessarily, and this change is going to solve a lot of the problems. It's definitely giving kids a chance to make money, but it's not like a magic wand, I don't think. Or am I off in my thinking?
No, you are absolutely spot on with that. I was actually just talking about this last night at my book launch, because name, image, and likeness has been such a huge topic of conversation lately. It's also a basic human right to be able to monetize what is rightfully yours. Mm-hmm. And that's something that the NCAA has strategically stripped from college athletes ever since the 1950s. They have been very, very intentional on making sure that college athletes are so-called amateurs and that they cannot monetize their NILs. And the only reason that they lifted their restrictions is because they were forced to by state pressure. So the NCAA, for all of its PR about being pro-athlete and pro-NIL and wanting to modernize, it is entirely inaccurate. The NCAA has been nothing but resistant to name, image, and likeness. And in light of all of that, name, image, and likeness has been a wonderful benefit for college athletes. Any college student should be able to become an influencer or should be able to take on a side job related to their skills. Like that, it's a basic human right. However, what it does for college athletes.
Let me step in here, because before NIL, it would get to so absurd to the point that like it wasn't just like within their specialty. A kid couldn't get a job, period. Like again, my experience is like guys wouldn't be able to take their girlfriends out for like a date on the weekend, right? They wouldn't be able to go out. They wouldn't have to scrape money together and hope they found enough underneath the mattress to buy a cheap 6-pack of beer to go to like a frat party.
Yeah, I mean, food insecurity is a huge problem for college athletes. And I mean, it's always been a big problem. The NCAA has amended it used to have limitations on meals and snacks. It lifted the restriction, but it did not require universities to provide food for athletes who are struggling with food insecurity. And so, we're talking about basic needs that college athletes aren't getting. And name, image, and likeness, it can help in those areas, but it's not going to solve the root problem of exploitation. And it actually creates more work for these athletes, because they have to put effort into their social media. They have to potentially book clients or, block off time to sign autographs. And again, they should be allowed to do that. That's not a bad thing. But it's completely different than, treating a college athlete like an employee and providing, meaningful income, providing long-term health care and benefits that could actually help them and solving the exploitation, which is the root problem in the college sports industry.
Well, I mean, we didn't mention. No, that was like totally great, because when you talk about exploitation and you talk about how dehumanization and you talk about how like so many of these structural issues go back to like even the 50s, it reminds me a lot of America, right? It's just like, and like these are societal issues, and they're not necessarily just reflective of college sports. But the one area you did bring up that I'm always fascinated about, because it's a story that it doesn't matter for what we're about to talk about, but it makes healthcare extremely personal. Actually, healthcare is just extremely personal to everybody. And anybody who tries to tell me that they love their insurance company is a liar. Even people who have the Cadillac version of the insurance, like someone like me, I hate them. They're useless. The insurance companies are absolutely horrible to deal with. They're worthless. And this opens the door to two things, which is like the treatment of the athletes during the pandemic, and then the long-term implications of how poorly, and I guess I'm editorializing here, how poorly the athletes were treated, because again it goes back to one of your original statements about dehumanization of the athletes during the thing. How or what can be done to fix? I mean, I know what can be done, and just like stop acting like knuckleheads, but what can either fans of college athletics or the athletes themselves do to help gain a little more equitable care? Because there's going to be long-term health implications that we don't have any idea about right now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you talking about equitable care for college athletes? What
Yeah, because I mean, they were out there putting their, they're putting their lives on the line for sports ball, as like my friend calls it, during a pandemic where if anybody who hasn't seen the 60-minute special with Ed Ogeron at LSU, didn't see that thing. If you didn't come away from that horrified by like, for any parent that turned their kid over to him to be the steward of their child's college experience, then you have a mental challenge, because it was like he was so dismissive of safety and security and healthcare for the kids that it was like scary almost. And like it was completely normalized by 60 Minutes. It was, yeah. I mean, I don't get offended or shocked by much anymore because I'm too jaded for that. I was shocked by how bad it was. So that's the kind of the lens I'm seeing it through. It's because I know he's one example of probably hundreds
Yeah, there are so many Ed Orgerons in college sports. You know, he's just a symptom of the overall problem, and just the dismissal of the health and safety of college athletes. And as far as what people can do about it, it's a very complicated problem, you know, because the NCAA is a very powerful institution. It's very hard to get to the center of the NCAA, and like you can't just write up Mark Emmert, the NCAA president, and say like, hey, we want this to happen, and then he's going to be like, okay, yeah, I'll do it, like that, you know. In a perfect world, yeah, like that would be, but that's not going to happen. So honestly, for fans, there are two things that fans can actually do. Is that the first one is that they can get political, so they can pay attention to what their state representatives are saying about college athletes, because now we're seeing these issues enter, and sports and politics are always inextricable, but we're seeing very overt intersections of sports and politics in terms of state level laws and even federal laws that are going to impact college athletes. Getting politically involved, paying attention to what state representatives are saying about the issues, what they're doing in terms of signing bills and laws. That's very, very important. And then, you know, talking with your vote that way. Another way that people, sports fans, can get involved is that they can talk with their viewership and they can talk with their money. And so because, you know, sports fans stop watching the games until college athletes are treated well, then it puts the NCAA in a pretty bad position. That is going to be complicated because, like I said, the NCAA is a very powerful institution. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, and so it's a difficult entity to take down that way. But at the university level, what donors can do is they can either pool donations, or they can say, hey, you know, I'm not going to donate this unless the department does XYZ for the athletes. And so that those are some ways that fans can get involved if they want to. Again, it's going to be a long and difficult process because even, you know, universities are pretty powerful, but just getting involved at that level can speak volumes. And a way that athletes can actually get involved is through a potential March Madness strike. Because the NCAA makes about 80% of their annual revenue through the March Madness tournament. So if the athletes were to organize together and say, hey, NCAA, we are not going to play unless these conditions are fulfilled, then, I mean, the NCAA, they'd essentially have to listen. There have been whispers of March Madness strikes for several years now. It almost happened last year, but what was missing from all of that discourse was an ultimatum. And it's complicated for athletes because they have a lot to lose. You know, they've worked hard to make it to the national championship. If their coaches don't like what they're doing, they could potentially lose. It could affect their draft status in the NBA. And so it's a complicated tapestry when we talk about how fans and athletes can get involved, but there are ways to sort of crack into the system.
Yeah, and then I won't even pretend to ask the question. Actually, I won't. I guess I will pretend to ask the question just so we can laugh. You know, but if you're in the college athletics side and you really want to create change, and I know it's not universal, but we'll still have a good laugh in a second. Like, what can you do? You know, because like, you know, I know not everybody is like completely going to be dismissive of the human rights of these athletes, and, you know, or like looking to restrain their ability to make money for themselves. You know, there are people who are like me who grew up in the South. The only way out was education, who went to college. I mean, I know a lot of them that went to the University of Alabama with me, you know, and they understand what's going on here. You know, but as like a, you know, low, mid level, even, and I mean, I guess athletic directors can do it. They have the greatest ability to change. You know, what kind of guidance or suggestions would you give those people to help them? Because, you know, in theory, everybody gets into this thing because they want to help kids have a better life. They want to help them get the education. They want them to continue their athletic careers. They're not starting out from a point of wanting to do harm.
Mm-hmm. I would say the best thing that anyone involved in college sports can do is to talk to college athletes. Because I'm working on my dissertation right now about paternalism in college athletics and how college athletes are infantilized and controlled by various different ways. And one of these ways is that they have so many people above them in positions of power who are making decisions that directly impact them without talking to the athletes themselves. And so the best thing that a person in that position can do to help athletes is get their opinions on things before making decisions for athletes, thinking that you know what's best for them. Because it is kind of patronizing when that happens, when someone who's presumably never been a college athlete says, I know what's best for college athletes, and acts on whatever knowledge they have there, without directly consulting the people that their decisions are going to impact.
Yeah, I guess that's
pretty simple.
Yeah, I was gonna say, look at us. Like I asked a serious question and we didn't laugh, and then we had a serious answer. I mean, we're like totally rocking over here. But I want to touch back on the political thing too for a second, because if people are paying attention to the conversation here, what has been interesting to me is that with some of the political action, especially at the state levels, it's not necessarily breaking along what we would consider a traditional left-right break either. It's been weird because you've actually seen I'm going to use this term loosely, political conservatives act in a way that has been like really beneficial for athletes in some states, and most of those states are where their football programs are very good, and they've been like going, we don't want to do anything that's going to hurt our football program, which I'm fairly sure that that's the reasoning behind it. But I'm going to ask you, like what does seem to be driving these things, and what can we learn? Because I know a big part of what you're doing with your book tour here is like helping people understand the dialogue and some of the conversations. And to me, that's an interesting one because, most of the time it's like, if you're on the right, left bad. And if you're on the left, right bad. And like this seems to be like an issue where those lines blurred. And I'm guessing most people don't know how to deal with that. I certainly don't.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic because in some ways, name, image, and likeness and those state laws have been bipartisan. There are certain delineations between Republican and Democratic bills. And it's honestly been kind of surprising to me that Republican led bills have been, by and large, more restrictive than Democrat led bills. There are bills in committee right now, at least at the federal level, that are certainly more restrictive on the Republican side than on the Democrat side. But by and large, name, image, and likeness is fairly bipartisan. And I think the reason for that is because there are financial implications to name, image, and likeness. Name, image, and likeness rights for college athletes can stimulate state economies. Some of these state laws have stipulations that agents have to be licensed in the state, so keeping that revenue and those taxes in the state. And so there are definitely benefits for the states financially, which is one of the reasons I think that other legislation about college athletes have either died in committee or never made it out of the introductory stage. There have been college athlete bills of rights that address things like health and safety, athlete abuse, and things like that don't really make it very far. And unfortunately, I think that really goes back to the commercial aspect of college sports, and that athletes are typically viewed in terms of how much revenue that they can produce or what they can do for people. And so I think that is an unfortunate undertone to all the progress that name, image, and likeness has made. But I do think that that's one of the reasons that it's very universally accepted too. So it's an interesting tension there.
Yeah. Well, and let me ask you this, and this may be outside of the scope of your knowledge, and if it's so, it's completely cool. But it hits me, and I pay a little bit more attention to this aspect of things. And I think it's just because I studied a lot of history over the years, which is and we seem to be entering a stage where antitrust enforcement and conversation around antitrust has become much more prominent and much more likely to actually see something happen. Do you think that has had any impact on the reason that some of this stuff is bipartisan or even being taken more seriously? Because Major League Baseball has the antitrust exemption, but the NCAA seems like it could be like right in the crosshairs for any kind of antitrust enforcement if they're not careful. And this could be like, I guess, an unintentional first act in any battle that they could be dealing with.
Yeah, well, a really important case that was settled in 2021 was NCAA versus Alston. And that was an antitrust case that challenged the NCAA's ability to cap educationally related benefits. So things like non-cash and certain cash benefits for college athletes related to academics, scholarships, certain scholarships, equipment like laptops and things like that. And the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against the NCAA. So I think that really opened the floodgates for people to challenge the NCAA in very unique ways that they haven't been challenged before. I think that's another reason the NCAA has been so hands off with name, image, and likeness, and has instead deferred to the states and deferred to universities to write their own policies because they're terrified of another, antitrust lawsuit. And so I think the NCAA is kind of playing scared right now. And I think that they're also certainly still vying for that antitrust exemption.
Yeah, I was going to say, as you talked about them taking the loss, and I was like going, this is what happens when you punch a bully, and the first time they get punched in the nose, they don't know how to deal with it anymore. They can't, they run and hide. And I guess that like all of this conversation, like first off, to get the Supreme Court to vote unanimously on anything, you have like definitely got a loser of a case on your hands. But at the same time,
they were scathing. Like Brett Kavanaugh, he was saying that in any other industry, the NCAA's business model would be flatly illegal, that the NCAA is not above the law. So they really came down hard on the NCAA.
I mean, if Brett Kavanaugh is saying that, he's not known for his, friendliness to the worker. so I mean, it must be a bad situation.
Right.
Brett Kavanaugh got the laughs. That's it's probably appropriate. But back to the serious thing is like it seems that a lot of chips are lining up because as we started with the pandemic, we started to see how over leveraged. I think if I'm being nice, I'm trying to be balanced, even though I think that my point of view has come across like probably here more than like most cases. Over leveraged, heavily burdened with debt, I believe, yet at the same time bringing in hundreds of millions to billions of dollars a year to the point that like it was not necessarily a given that like the Cal Berkeley's athletic department was going to have to file bankruptcy because they were over $500 million in debt. Now, Cal Berkeley ain't the University of Alabama, to be fair either. Like, how in the world are you ever going to retire all of that debt, right? You're not in the SEC. You're in the Pac-12 that's kind of like lag behind the rest of the things. Like, what are you investing in, A? And then, like, how irresponsible are you? And then the bigger question is, like, how does that point to just an instability or a business model that is likely either on its last legs or like heading for a collapse or like going to something new?
I think it is
be all of the above too. It's totally.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on if the industry doesn't innovate. And you mentioned earlier, asking what are they investing in? And I would ask, what are they not investing in? Because I look at women's sports, all major women's sports leagues experienced growth during the pandemic, like during the 2020 season. Female athletes are absolutely crushing it in name, image, and likeness. They have, some of them have hundreds of thousands to millions of followers. So female athletes are incredibly marketable, and women's sports viewership is also very impressive. It's not going to bring in, SEC football money, but so many women's programs could be revenue generators if these athletic directors put in the same level or even a proportionate level of effort that they put into football and men's basketball. The problem is that there's a very old school way of thinking in most of these programs where a lot of athletic director, and this is something that I experienced as an athlete too, watching our athletic director put all of his time and energy into football and men's basketball, and cutting other programs, thinking that that was the way to climb the ladder. And it's only going to end up putting these universities in more debt. So these universities, they have to innovate or they're going to be left behind because the sports industry is evolving very quickly. And so people need to be ahead of the curve or they're going to fall behind.
Oh yes, the rise of women's sports. We don't know each other we know each other very much better than we did an hour ago. We don't know each other very well, but you won't know that I have been since many years ago. I have been like going, look, just do it out of greed. Invest in women's sports because it's a huge market opportunity. I go to many examples on my in my newsletter each week. Talking tickets. So if anybody Googles it, you can get it. I see I plug. Okay. But I talk about the AFL women's, so the AFLW in Australia. And I had a chance to speak to the AFL's league day. And I talked about this thing like often what you find, and it goes back to that old school mentality you're talking about. Number one is that the old school mentality, we've always done it this way, is so toxic. Mm-hmm. That it's you can't get around it. But then number two, it just goes to like how much room there is for just like you talked about, like just again, you set the bar much higher than I would for people if you just gave it a little bit of attention because there's so much opportunity, right? It's the AFLW case study is amazing because they just did the proper job of marketing, which is like they did a little research, right? Like, they did a decent segmentation of the market built on what would be meaningful and actionable to their customers. Mm-hmm. And then they positioned themselves effectively in the market, right? They picked the target and they position, and they've had tremendous growth, right? To the point that I believe it happened this year because it's coming too quickly. But by next year, like maybe the term they use in Australia is professionalized it to the point where the women will be able to that will be their job. And that would be great. And it's not like it was a whole lot of effort. I mean, they worked very hard, but it wasn't like an insurmountable, like this thing was like, pushing rocks uphill mountains and stuff. No, it was like they just did the basics well. And that's like, when I look at most college athletics programs, that's what I see is that there's like this innovation thing is like, that's even further down the road. It's like innovation would be just getting the basics right.
Right. Well, and I think a big problem within athletic departments in the US is that we have so many athletic directors who view women's sports as a burden rather than an opportunity. Like I've been told so many times, that, oh, Katie, you're only here because of Title IX, or, your program takes money from the university. And it doesn't have to be like that. The NCAA, after the whole March Madness debacle last year with Sedona Prince talking about the resource discrepancies between the men and the women, the NCAA began an outside investigation into gender equity. And the Kaplan report found, among many other things, that the NCAA's lack of promotion of the women's March Madness tournament was shortchanging revenue in that area by roughly $80 million. And that's not the almost $1 billion that the men make, but that's significant revenue, and that kind of promotion and that kind of effort can be replicated at the university level. It just takes some creativity and some critical thinking and some willingness to do things in a different way.
Whoa. You're getting ahead of yourself there. Creativity and critical thinking. Hold on a second. Please. Yep. You're going to make my head spark. Hold on. MK, you've gone crazy. I opened the door and you've gone nuts. I
support you. You give me an inch and I'll take a mile.
See, I told you we would have fun at this thing. All right, so I think we could go about this all day long. And then it was like it would be like a cocktail hour where like the longer you have, the more drinks you have, like the like crazier it gets. And that would be bad for everybody.
Bourbon in the fridge, so.
Yeah, now we're talking. Well, you're from Kentucky, so you probably have something excellent too. So that's great. Next time we're together in Texas, then that's when it'll be a party.
Yep.
Let's turn it around to the book, though. Back to the book. And the book is called Surviving the Second Tier. And it is not a horror story, though it is. And it is not dystopian, even though it is. But you can blurb that on like the second edition.
I love that. Yeah, I'm gonna put that on the sleeve of the book.
Exactly. We'll totally do that. I'll write up a nice blurb for you. As people read the book, I know because you talk so you put it so well when you talked about like statistics, even though they should get people's attention, don't always cut through. And part of that is that what is that saying that goes? It's very hard to get a man to see something when his financial interests are involved that he doesn't want to see. I believe that's a little bit what goes on here. What would you want people to think about as they're reading the book? Because as an author, you wrote to convey a point. Same way when I host a podcast or I do a newsletter, I'm trying to teach somebody something. What do you want people to take away from your book?
That's such a great question. One thing that I would really like for them to take away is that the life of a college athlete, it might look really glamorous on the outside. And the NCAA, for all of its faults, is great at PR, is great at media work. They package college sports in a way that is very entertaining, very exciting, and sports media do as well. And that's why professional and collegiate sports are such a big business because they are fun, they are exciting. I'm a sports fan, so I love watching sports. I love that kind of stuff. And I'm lucky enough to have the vantage point of somebody who has been through the NCAA to know that what is portrayed on television is not always entirely accurate. There is a lot of struggle that goes into being a college athlete. There are a lot of injuries, a lot of mental health issues, abuses of power at the coach level, at the university level, at the NCAA level, and just a lot of different tensions between teammates, and aspects of perfectionism, and things like that people do not see. And so I really wanted for people to think about and to just view college athletes and athletes in general in a different light after reading my book. I wanted them to see the human side of what is very glamorously portrayed on television.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's great. And, as you're talking about it too, it's like, it's not, there's a struggle, there's mental health things, that dehumanization thing that goes on. I have a friend who grew up, he was a professional basketball player. And he grew up not far from me, and we're still buddies. We don't live that far away from each other, and we talk about that too. It's like there's always like somebody it's a struggle because you always feel like somebody wants something from you. You can't trust people's motivations. It's a constant battle because you have a full-time job if you're a competitive athlete in any shape or form, and yet a lot of these kids, again, come from these backgrounds where education is the only way out. And the only way they get the education is through the athletics, and you're trying to balance that. And then, frankly, in too many athletic departments, maybe it's changed a little bit since I went to college in the mid 90s. The kids are dismissed because they're just athletes. That's the best they can do. And it's wrong. I mean, because, my buddy's a freaking smart guy. He starts he started a couple businesses. He's raised kids that have gone to college and got their degrees and play in the NBA now. I mean, and his story is only because he's my friend that I am using him in context. But it's just like such a limiting and constrained environment, and it sucks. It's not glamorous, and I think people are like, I guess for me, when they think about the book and they look at it, the takeaway is I want them to see that there are real people behind this, right? And it's just that's sort of I'm with you. I'm a sports fan, and I love the stuff. But then at the same time, I don't want my enjoyment of the athletics to come at the expense of like somebody else's mental health, their well-being. I don't want to exploit somebody or take advantage of them. Right? They're bringing such happiness and joy to so many people. They deserve respect and opportunities and just like all the great benefits that like that their happiness has brought to others. I mean, they deserve great stuff too. I mean, that's just the way I view it, and it's kind of the lens I see through everything is like I look at the people first, and so like if I had to take away from people as they read this, I would like use the opportunity to read a novel as an opportunity to think about the humanity and the people and the stories behind like all of these things that we love so much.
Yeah, and the novel was always designed to be a vehicle for these uncomfortable truths. I think that dystopias just have this very unique way of sticking with readers in a way, like you mentioned, it's not a dystopia, but it is, because they hit a little too close to home. And so I wanted to present these uncomfortable facts in a way that was more engaging and more, I hate to use the word entertaining, but, just more palatable than those facts and those statistics. And you brought up a point about wanting to enjoy sports, but not at the expense of other people. And I think the most important lesson that I've learned as a graduate student who critically studies sports is that you can be very critical of something and also love it at the same time. And I would also argue that your being critical of something that you love just means that you love it more than you would something else that you're not critical of, because if you're critical of something in a constructive way, that means that you value it enough to see its shortcomings and to want it to improve. And so that curiosity and that critical thinking and even the anger that can come from that, those are all good things. And so I always encourage people to lean into that, if they ever have questions about an industry or anything that they find problematic, just do the research and don't be afraid to think critically. Because for a while I was like, I don't think I want to study this because I'm going to ruin my love for college sports if I do. But I have found that I love college sports even more now because I see what college sports could be if we transform it. And I love the idea of that image in the future.
No, I think that's a good message to close on. Ncaa, but I guess I will add one thing, and I'll call you Katie since I won't use your pen name now. If being critical about things you love, that's the whole point of this. And it's like really the whole point of like everything I do. It's like going, I only give a shit because I care so much, and I know how powerful this stuff is. So MK, how can people find you on the internet?
That's a great question. So I'm on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me. My handle is @LeverFever. It's just my last name, LEVERFEVER, because I went to high school at the height of Bieber fever, and that's when I had started social media.
That's awesome.
And the links to buy Surviving the Second Tier, they're on both of my social media platforms. You can also find it on Amazon. Just search Surviving the Second Tier, and tier is spelled TIER, like a cake. I always like to, because it could be different. So I always like to just make sure that we're on the same page.
The English language is confusing sometimes, and this is one of those cases. Oh, well, awesome. I mean, maybe we can I can have you back under more fun circumstances, like kids are given better health care or something, like for their athletics, something like that. And that would be awesome. So but this was great. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Let me know what you thought of my conversation with MK Lever. Send me an email. It is my name, Dave@davewakeman.com. You can send me whether you liked it, where you thought it sucked, how much you hate me, whatever. I don't care. Just send the email. I don't care. Vent. I don't mind. Check out my website, davewakeman.com. You'll find blogs, articles, all kinds of stuff. There's links to newsletter signups, all that great stuff. Make sure you check out the Talking Tickets newsletter, talkingtickets.substack.com. That's where some of the best work goes on, some of the best thinking. Really, it is a tool that has come to mean a lot to people, but it means a lot to me because it helps me figure out exactly what I think on topics. But you can get it. It's really well received. TalkingTickets.substack.com. You'll be the first to find out about all the upcoming events and conferences and everything else I'll be doing over the next few months. Speaking of which, make sure you check out the Booking Protect team at the Ticketing Professionals Conference in Birmingham, England. It is March 16th, 17th, and 18th at a new location, the NEC in Birmingham, which is a little bit outside near the airport. And they tell me it's going to be even more fun than normal. More parties, more people, more fun. Andrew and Carol throw a tremendous party. Simon will be doing a talk about security after the terrorist attack at the arena in Manchester. The Booking Protect team will be there rocking and rolling, throwing down. So make sure you check it out. There could be a special guest. Make sure that if you do need to talk to somebody, I'm a resource for you, right? Hit me up, davidwakeman.com. Don't feel like you got to get through all of this crap alone. I am here for you. I want to thank you for listening. My throat is still jammed up from the COVID, but I'm totally fine. But just let me know you're doing all right. Send me a note. Oh, also, I should not forget to check out the link for the Podfront survey. That will help me out tremendously. All right, so do that up. Get that filled out for me. I'll love you to death for it. I love you anyway. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Take it easy.